Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a monumental constitutional court judgment that literally shaped the financial future of post-apartheid Johannesburg. Now this isn't just some dry story about taxes or boring legal statutes. No, this is the story of Fedsure Life Assurance versus the Greater Johannesburg Transitional Metropolitan Council. It's an absolutely fascinating legal battle over how you actually go about fixing a deeply divided city, not just on paper, but in reality.
All right, let's dive right in by understanding the visceral reality of the apartheid city's exploitative logic. The quote we're looking at perfectly encapsulates the geographical legacy the new democracy inherited. You see, the city was designed with a system of apartheid zoning that deliberately, intentionally favored white urban areas at the direct cost of black townships. It wasn't just keeping people apart, it was a systematic, engineered separation of wealth and resources.
The geographic legacy we're dealing with here is stark. On one hand, you had white suburbs characterized by highly developed infrastructure, thriving commercial districts, and incredibly valuable property bases. On the other hand, black townships were plagued by severe underdevelopment and vastly inferior tax bases. And here's the tragic irony. Black residents were basically forced to commute into white commercial hubs to work and spend their money. They were leaving their labor and their wealth behind in a completely separate legal jurisdiction. So the wealth was generated by everyone, but legally captured by only one half of the city.
Which brings us to Section 1. Unifying a divided city. To dismantle this massive structural inequality, the 1993 interim constitution required a complete legal restructuring of local government. I mean, you couldn't just snap your fingers and erase decades of spatial planning, right? You needed a concrete legal mechanism. So the Local Government Transition Act created a three-stage timeline to gradually merge these fragmented, unequal areas into unified democratic cities. It started with a pre-interim phase in early '94 with temporary councils, followed by an interim phase triggered by the first democratic local elections, and eventually a final phase of permanent legislation. Today, we're going to zero in on the crucial, and honestly quite messy, actions taken during that interim phase.
In Johannesburg, 13 old, race-based councils were just completely dissolved. They were replaced by one overarching body, the Transitional Metropolitan Council, or TMC, which worked alongside 4 regional substructures. The TMC was essentially the dominant engine driving this whole transformation. Their monumental task? Creating one equitable city out of 13 highly unequal pieces.
That leads us perfectly into Section 2, the 438 million rand dispute. So, bringing these wealthy and impoverished areas together immediately created a massive financial collision. You've got one unified city now, but vastly different financial realities on the ground. How do you balance the books? Well, for the 1996 to 1997 budget, the unified city decided to apply a single, uniform property rate across the board. And the magic number they landed on was 6.45 cents in the rand. This one uniform rate was applied to all rateable property across the entire newly combined metropolitan area.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the math. Because of those historical disparities in property values we talked about, applying that one uniform rate meant historically wealthy areas suddenly generated massive financial surpluses, while the historically poorer areas generated massive deficits. To balance the unified city's books, those funds had to move.
And this resulted in the TMC ordering the wealthy Eastern Metropolitan Substructure, the EMS, to hand over a staggering 438 million rand surplus to subsidize the deficits in the western and southern areas, as well as the TMC itself. Just take a second to let that number sink in. 438 million rand. This wasn't some minor accounting adjustment. It was a massive, immediate transfer of wealth designed to equalize service delivery.
So naturally, this sparks a huge question. Can a city council actually legally tax a wealthy suburb to create a 438 million rand surplus solely to subsidize poorer areas? Well, 10 ratepayer groups, including Fedsure Life Assurance, completely rebelled. They took the city straight to court, claiming this huge wealth redistribution was totally unlawful and ultra-virus, which is legal speak for being completely beyond the city's legal powers.
Let's unpack the legal arguments in Section 3, administrative versus legislative power.
To solve this massive financial dispute, the Constitutional Court had to answer what is honestly a fiercely philosophical question about the very nature of government power under the new Constitution. The entire legal battle hinged on the difference between administrative action and legislative action. The ratepayers argued the budget was an administrative action, and if it's administrative, the court can strictly review it for procedural fairness.
The city, on the other hand, argued that passing a budget was a legislative action, born of original democratic power, meaning the court should be way more hesitant to overturn it. Think of it like this. Administrative action is kind of like being a hired manager following a really strict rule book. You just execute the law. But legislative action? Actually, scratch that. It's more like being the elected board of directors who write the rule book. Prior to the new constitution, local governments were treated more like those managers, just executing rules from the national government. But the new constitution completely flipped that dynamic on its head.
The court came down definitively on this. They ruled that under the new constitutional order, a local government isn't just a delegated manager anymore. They are a deliberative legislative assembly. When a city council debates and passes a budget to raise taxes, they're making a political legislative choice, one they are directly accountable to voters for. They are exercising a constitutional legislative power, not merely an administrative one. So the ratepayers couldn't just have the budget thrown out on standard administrative review grounds.
But the fight wasn't over yet. Welcome to Section 4, the divided court decides. Okay, so the budget was a valid legislative act. But the ratepayers weren't done. They had one final super technical legal weapon regarding exactly how that 438 million rand figure was calculated. The transition law governing the city, specifically a clause known as Item 23C, clearly stated that any financial contribution claimed from a substructure had to be an equitable contribution and mathematically based on gross or rates income. This was the strict written rule the city had to follow when moving money around.
The ratepayers pointed straight at the raw data. The EMS had a gross income of over 1.1 billion rand and a rates income of 655 million. And the levy imposed? Exactly 438,330,000 rand. The ratepayers argued this massive levy wasn't some carefully calculated percentage based on gross or rates income at all. It was literally just the raw surplus left over after the EMS's expenses were trimmed. They argued the city just took whatever was left in the bank, totally ignoring the strict formula required by the law.
And this created a massive and frankly fascinating legal dilemma. Pretty much everyone agreed that redistributing the wealth was a legitimate, necessary goal to heal the city. But did the city break the strict constitutional rules of taxation to achieve it? If they just grabbed the raw surplus without basing it on the required formula, did that technical violation completely invalidate this massive, necessary step for historical justice? In a totally dramatic climax, the highest court in the land split right down the middle, literally 5-5. 5 justices looked at the numbers and found the levy unlawful because it wasn't mathematically based on income as the statute required. But the other 5 justices found it perfectly lawful, arguing that taking the surplus generated by the rates was a way of basing the levy on the rates income, fulfilling the law's broader equitable purpose. A perfect deadlocked tie. So, what actually happens in a tie? Well, because of this incredibly rare 50-50 split, the ratepayers simply failed to secure a majority to overturn the High Court's initial ruling. That meant the lower court's decision in favor of the city stood. The uniform rate of 6.45 cents was declared valid, and that 438 million rand redistribution was allowed to proceed, fundamentally shifting the financial landscape of Johannesburg forever.
As we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a really profound reality to ponder. The Fedsure's case shows us just how incredibly messy the mechanics of justice can actually be. When you are facing profound, deeply entrenched historical inequality, how exactly should a society balance the strict, pedantic letter of the law with the urgent moral imperative to redistribute resources? It's a tension that literally split the constitutional court in half, and it's a question that continues to resonate in democracies around the world today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope this deep dive helped clarify the complex legal architecture behind building a more equitable society.